The ivory keys of the upright piano were yellowed and chipped, like old teeth in a weary smile, but under Florence Hayes's touch, they wept pure silver. The tune was a mournful Chopin nocturne, a piece far too delicate for the smoky, gin-soaked air of the Gilded Sparrow, a speakeasy that clung to the grimy underbelly of Chicago. The patrons, a mix of listless flappers and weary men whose faces were etched with the memory of the Great War, hardly noticed. They were here to drown their sorrows, not to appreciate the sublime artistry of a girl who clearly didn't belong. Florence didn't belong, and she knew it. Just a year ago, her world had been one of sunlit conservatories and the exacting tutelage of masters who spoke of her potential in hushed, reverent tones. Her future was meant to be a grand symphony hall, not this cramped, dimly lit room where the stench of stale cigars and cheap perfume clung to her velvet dress. But her father's lungs, weakened by mustard gas in the trenches of the Marne, had finally given out, leaving him a ghost in his own home. And his hands, once steady, had grown shaky, finding solace not in work, but in the desperate gamble of cards in back-alley games. The debts had piled up like dead leaves in autumn, burying them both. So Florence played. She played for pennies, and stray dollar bills dropped into a jar by her bench, each clink a painful reminder of how far she had fallen. Her music was her only escape, the 88 keys a small kingdom where she was still queen. As her fingers danced through the final, heartbreaking chords of the nocturne, a profound loneliness washed over her. She played of loss, of dreams deferred, and of a quiet hope that flickered like a dying candle in a storm. For a fleeting moment, the cacophony of the bar seemed to hush, a few heads turning as the last crystalline note hung in the air, shimmering and fragile, before being swallowed by a burst of raucous laughter from a nearby table. The spell was broken. Her set was over. Florence offered a small, almost invisible nod to the bartender, a man named Howard with a perpetually grim expression, and slipped away from the piano. She gathered her meager earnings, tucking the worn bills into her thin coat pocket. The amount was barely enough to buy her father's medicine, let alone make a dent in the mountain of debt owed to a man whose name was only ever whispered, Cecil Vance. The biting November wind whipped down the narrow street as she stepped outside, a stark slap of reality after the cloying warmth of the speakeasy. It carried the distant wail of a jazz trumpet and the rumble of a passing Ford Model T, the sounds of a city that was roaring, alive, and utterly indifferent to her plight. She pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her, the collar doing little to ward off the chill that seeped into her bones. Her walk home was a nightly ritual of fear. The gaslights cast long dancing shadows that played tricks on the eye, turning discarded crates into crouching figures and gusts of wind into menacing whispers. Tonight, the whispers felt real. She quickened her pace, her worn leather shoes echoing on the wet cobblestones. The alley that served as a shortcut to her tenement building loomed ahead, a dark, gaping mouth. Normally she would take the long way around, but the cold was relentless, and the thought of her father's shallow breathing spurred her on. It was a mistake. Halfway through the passage, two figures detached themselves from the deeper shadows, blocking her path. They were large men, their forms bulky under heavy wool coats, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Florence's exhaustion. Well, look what we have here, the first man rasped, his voice a gravelly sneer. He took a step forward, and the faint light caught the glint of a grimy signet ring on his finger. The little songbird. Your daddy sent us to collect his dues. I don't have it, Florence stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She backed away, her spine pressing against the cold, damp brick of the wall. Please, just a little more time. I'll have it soon. The second man chuckled, a low, guttural sound that held no humor. Time's up, dollface. Mr. Vance ain't a patient man, but he is creative. He said if you couldn't pay with cash, you could pay in kind. A private performance, you might say. His meaning was brutally clear. Nausea churned in Florence's stomach, hot and acidic. The world narrowed to the grimy brick behind her and the leering shapes before her. She was trapped. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer catching in her throat. She had played her final, tragic melody. It was then that a new sound cut through the tension, the low, confident purr of a finely tuned engine. It was different from the clatter of the common Fords. This was a sound of power, of wealth. A sleek black automobile, polished to a mirror shine, glided to a silent stop at the mouth of the alley. its headlamps cutting two brilliant cones of light through the darkness, pinning the two thugs in their glare. The driver's side door opened. A figure emerged, stepping into the light with an unhurried grace that was more menacing than any sudden movement. He was tall and broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that spoke of money and authority. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his jaw set like granite. But it was his eyes that held Florence captive. They were the color of a winter sky, cold and assessing, and they swept over the scene with an unnerving stillness, missing nothing. He looked first at the thugs, then at her, and in his gaze there was no pity, no heroism, only a flat, chilling appraisal, as if he were calculating the value of everything in the alley, including her. "She's with me," the man said. His voice was not loud, but it carried an absolute authority that sliced through the night air. It was deep and smooth, like aged whiskey, but with an edge of steel. The two thugs exchanged a nervous glance. They recognized power when they saw it. "Now see here, mister," the first one blustered, trying to reclaim his footing. "This is business. Cecil Vance's business." The stranger took another deliberate step forward, his polished shoes clicking softly on the cobblestones. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm aware. Tell Vance that Walter Sterling has acquired his debt." The name fell into the silence like a stone into a frozen lake. Walter Sterling. Even Florence, insulated in her world of music and worry, had heard that name. It was a name spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence in the city's shadows, the name of a man who ran the most powerful bootlegging empire in Chicago. A man who was more myth than mortal, a ruthless king in a city of gangsters. The thug's bravado evaporated instantly, replaced by a raw, undisguised fear. "Mr. Sterling," the first one stammered, his hat suddenly in his hands. We didn't know. No disrespect intended." Walter Sterling ignored them. His gaze was fixed on Florence, who remained pressed against the wall, too terrified to move, too shocked to breathe. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a thick roll of bills, peeling off several and tossing them at the feet of the first thug. The money fluttered to the wet ground. "That covers the principal and Vance's exorbitant interest," he stated, his tone clipped and final. "Now get out of my sight before I lose my patience." The men scrambled to pick up the cash, mumbling apologies, before melting back into the shadows from which they came, their retreat as swift and cowardly as their attack had been brazen. The alley was suddenly quiet, save for the hum of the car's engine and the frantic pounding of Florence's own heart. She was alone with Walter Sterling. He stood there, an impassive silhouette against the blinding headlights, studying her. She felt like a butterfly pinned to a board, every tremor of her fear exposed under his piercing gaze. "Thank you," she finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling. I don't know how I can ever repay you." He closed the distance between them in two long strides. He stopped just before her, so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of cedar and expensive tobacco. He was even more imposing up close, a monolith of controlled danger. "Oh, you will repay me," he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine, a fear entirely different from what she'd felt before. "Every last cent." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold neutrality. He was not her savior. He was her new owner. "The debt is paid, Florence Hayes," Walter Sterling declared, his voice leaving no room for argument or appeal. "But the transaction is not complete. From this moment on, you belong to me." He gestured curtly towards the open door of the Ford T. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. A different kind of dread, deeper and more profound, settled over her. She hadn't been rescued. She had been acquired. Numbly, on legs that felt like they might buckle, she walked towards the car, a prisoner stepping into a new, far more elegant and infinitely more dangerous cage. The solid, definitive thud of the car door slamming shut was the sound of her old life ending, and a terrifying new symphony beginning. The ride through Chicago's glittering, nocturnal heart was conducted in a profound and heavy silence. Florence sat stiffly on the plush leather seat of the Ford, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blur of electric lights and laughing figures flashing past the window. Each street corner, each familiar landmark, felt like a farewell. She was a ghost gliding through a city that was no longer hers. Beside her, Walter Sterling was an unnerving presence of stillness. He did not look at her. He simply drove, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his profile a chiseled silhouette against the passing city lights. The silence in the car was not peaceful. It was a vacuum filled with unspoken threats and the terrifying weight of her new reality. He drove them not to the industrial soot-stained districts where she imagined his business was conducted, but to the city's most opulent artery, where new skyscrapers clawed at the night sky. The building he stopped before was a monument of limestone and ambition, its Art Deco spires piercing the clouds. A uniformed doorman rushed forward, his expression a carefully crafted mask of deference as he opened Walter's door, then hers. "Mr. Sterling." "Good evening, sir." Walter gave a curt nod, his hand lightly but firmly on Florence's elbow, guiding her out of the car and into the grand lobby. It was a cathedral of modernity, with gleaming marble floors, geometric brass fixtures that cast a warm golden glow, and a soaring ceiling that made her feel impossibly small. He led her to a private elevator, its gate a latticework of polished bronze. As they ascended in the silent wood-paneled box, the feeling of being trapped intensified with every floor they passed. This was not a rescue, it was an abduction, orchestrated with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. The elevator opened directly into his home, the penthouse. Florence's breath caught in her throat. The space was immense, a sprawling expanse of polished hardwood floors, expensive oriental rugs and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of Chicago. The city lights spread out below them like a carpet of scattered diamonds, a beautiful, indifferent expanse. The furniture was sleek and modern, all dark wood and rich fabrics, arranged with a minimalist precision that bespoke a man who valued order and control above all else. It was magnificent. And it was as cold and impersonal as a museum. Walter released her arm. The absence of his touch was as jarring as its presence had been. He walked to a bar carved from dark mahogany, pouring himself a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He did not offer her any. "These are the terms, Miss Hayes," he said, his back still to her. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to issuing decrees. "You will reside here. You will be provided with food, clothing, anything material you may require. A housekeeper, Mildred, will attend to your needs. You are to be treated as a guest in all matters but one." He turned, swirling the whiskey in his glass. His winter sky eyes met hers, and they held no warmth, no compassion. They were the eyes of a banker assessing an asset. "You will not leave this apartment. You will not contact anyone from your former life. You will speak to no one without my permission. My home is now your world. The debt your father incurred is substantial. Your safety from men like Vance and others far worse requires your complete isolation. Is that understood?" Florence could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. The sheer audacity of it, the cold-blooded ownership in his tone stole the air from her lungs. He had bought her safety, but the price was her life, her very self. She was a rare bird he had captured, now destined to live within the confines of this beautiful gilded cage. "Good," he said, taking a slow sip of his drink, as if he had just concluded a mundane piece of business. He gestured towards a hallway. "Your room is the second door on the left. Mildred has already prepared it. Her room." The phrase was so domestic, so normal, yet it sounded obscene in this context. A prisoner's cell, no matter how lavishly appointed, was still a cell. She felt a surge of desperate defiance, a spark of the proud, conservatory-trained musician who refused to be broken. "And what am I to do?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with an indignation she couldn't suppress. "Am I simply to sit here and decay?" For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. It wasn't anger, but perhaps curiosity. He set his glass down with a soft click. "You will do whatever it is you do," he said dismissively. Then his gaze swept across the vast living area and settled on the far corner of the room. Florence followed his line of sight, and her heart gave a painful lurch. There, gleaming under the soft light of a standing lamp, was a piano. It was not a worn, chipped upright like the one at the Gilded Sparrow. This was a grand piano, a magnificent beast of polished ebony, its lid propped open to reveal a pristine, immaculate set of keys. It was an instrument worthy of a concert hall, sitting in silent splendor in the corner of her prison. She stared at it, a confusing maelstrom of emotions swirling within her. It was a cruel joke, a beautiful torture, to give her the one thing she loved most in the world, the very soul of her freedom, in the one place she could never be free. Walter watched her, his expression a carefully guarded mask. "I purchased it this afternoon," he stated, a simple fact devoid of emotion. "I am told it is the finest instrument money can buy." He had planned this. He had known who she was, what she did. He hadn't just stumbled upon her in that alley. He had sought her out. The realization was a fresh wave of cold dread. This wasn't impulsive. It was premeditated. "Play something," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Florence hesitated, her body rigid with a mixture of fear and resentment. She wanted to refuse, to deny him the one part of her he couldn't physically own. But the pull of the instrument was magnetic. Her fingers ached to touch those perfect keys, to feel the weighted response, to hear a true, clear tone for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The piano was the only language she had left. Slowly, as if in a trance, she walked towards it. The ebony wood was cool and smooth beneath her fingertips. She sat on the padded bench, the plush velvet a world away from the wobbly stool she was used to. For a moment she simply looked at the keys, a stark landscape of black and white, of sorrow and hope. Then she took a deep breath and let her hands fall. She did not play Chopin this time. She played Debussy's Clair de Lune. The music flowed from her, a stream of liquid moonlight filling the cold, cavernous room. It was a melody of profound longing, of delicate beauty and heartbreaking solitude. It was the sound of her own soul crying out. She poured all her fear, her confusion and her shattering loneliness into the notes. She played for herself, for her lost future, for the father she couldn't protect. She forgot about Walter Sterling. She forgot she was a prisoner. For those few minutes, suspended in the magic of the music, she was free. The final note hung in the air, a perfect shimmering whisper that slowly faded into the oppressive silence. Florence kept her head bowed, her eyes closed, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. The silence stretched on. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and intense. She braced herself for a dismissive comment, a cold instruction, anything to shatter the fragile peace she had created. But no words came. When she finally dared to look up, he was standing by the window, his back to her once again, staring out at the city below. His posture was rigid, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, a solitary figure against a backdrop of a million distant lights. The music had touched something in him. She was certain of it. She had reached through the steel armor and found something human beneath. But he would never let her see it. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood before being swallowed by the long hallway. Florence was left alone with the magnificent piano, the silent city, and the deafening echo of her own melody. The cage was gilded, the view was stunning, and her captor was an enigma. And in the heart of that terrifying mystery, she realized her music had just become the only form of communication, and perhaps the only weapon she had left. The days bled into one another, each a perfect, sterile copy of the last. Time in the penthouse moved differently, measured not by the rising and setting of the sun over Lake Michigan, but by the meticulous routines established by an unseen hand. Mornings were for silent breakfasts, served by the quietly efficient housekeeper, Mildred, a woman whose face was a study in professional discretion. Afternoons were for staring out at a city she could see but not touch, a vibrant, roaring world locked behind a pane of glass. Evenings were for Walter's return. He would arrive as the city began to sparkle, bringing with him the chill of the outside air and the faint masculine sense of wool, tobacco, and something uniquely his, an aura of cold, absolute power. Their dinners were formal, silent affairs at the long, polished dining table, the cavernous space between them filled only with the clinking of silver on porcelain. He would ask no questions about her day, and she would offer no information. He was the warden, and she was the prisoner. It was a simple, brutal dynamic. Her only solace, her only true freedom, remained at the ebony grand piano. She played for hours, losing herself in the intricate architecture of Bach, the passionate storms of Beethoven, the melancholic poetry of Chopin. The music was her diary, her prayer, her rebellion. It was the one thing he could not command, the one part of her soul that remained untamed. And it was through the music that she began to see the first fissures in his granite facade. Sometimes late at night, she would be playing softly, and in the reflection on the piano's polished fallboard she would see him. He would stand in the darkened archway of the hall, believing himself unobserved, his formidable posture momentarily softened. He wouldn't watch her with the assessing gaze of an owner, but with a profound, gut-wrenching melancholy that seemed to absorb the notes she played, drawing them into a hidden well of sorrow within him. The moment she would falter, the instant he knew he was seen, he would be gone, melting back into the shadows, as if he were never there. Then came the nights. On two separate occasions, she was jolted from a restless sleep by a sound that did not belong in the pristine silence of the apartment. It was a guttural cry, choked and raw, coming from his room at the end of the hall. The first time, she had frozen in her bed, her heart pounding with fear. The second time, a strange, unwelcome empathy compelled her to creep from her room. She stood in the darkened hallway, listening. She heard a single word, wrenched from a place of deep agony. Retires, French, retreat. It was followed by a string of guttural, desperate sounds, the echoes of a place filled with mud and wire, and the scream of artillery. The Great War. The monster that had broken her father's body had clearly shattered something deep inside Walter Sterling's soul. The next morning he would appear as if nothing had happened, his eyes colder, the lines around his jaw tighter, the wall around him rebuilt, thicker and more impenetrable than before. Her curiosity, a dangerous and rebellious weed, began to grow in the sterile soil of her confinement. Who was this man, this king of the criminal underworld who wept for dead soldiers in his sleep and listened to classical music with the eyes of a grieving widower? The apartment, for all its luxury, was as impersonal as he was. There were no photographs, no personal trinkets, nothing to suggest a life beyond business and control, nothing except for the library. It was a room she had at first avoided, feeling it was the inner sanctum of his mind. But one long, quiet afternoon, she dared to push open the heavy oak door. The scent of old leather, paper, and cedar washed over her. Unlike the rest of the penthouse, this room felt lived in. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were packed with books, thick leather-bound classics, volumes of poetry, histories of war, and modern works by writers like Fitzgerald and Hemingway. A large, formidable desk stood before the window, its surface neat and organized. This was his throne room, the place where the gears of his empire turned. For weeks, she only browsed the titles, pulling down a book of Keats or a history of the Roman Empire, seeking escape in other worlds. But her gaze was always drawn to a simple, unadorned wooden box that sat on the lowest shelf, partially hidden behind a set of encyclopedias. It seemed out of place in the room's masculine order. It felt private. Today, her resolve broke. With a furtive glance towards the empty hallway, she knelt, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the box from its hiding place. It was unlocked. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small collection of items: a pressed brittle flower, a poppy, a small tarnished silver locket, and a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay a photograph. Her breath hitched. She picked it up. It was a picture of a young woman taken in what looked like a Parisian café. She was beautiful, but her beauty was a fire to Florence's water. Her dark hair was cut in a sharp, fashionable bob, a playful, defiant curl falling across her forehead. Her eyes were dark and full of laughter, and her lips were curved in a confident, knowing smile. She wore a string of pearls and a dress that was daringly modern, her entire being radiating a vibrant, fearless energy. She was the very essence of a flapper, a girl who danced on the edge of the world and laughed. On the back, in elegant, looping script, was a single word: Evelyn. Florence's fingers, almost of their own accord, untied the ribbon around the letters. The paper was thin, almost translucent with age. The postmarks were from France, dated 1918. The handwriting was the same elegant script as on the photograph. She read the first few lines of the top letter. My dearest Walter, the city is a madhouse, but your letters are my sanctuary. To think of you in the trenches while I am here, listening to jazz and sipping champagne, feels like a crime. But I do it for you. I live brightly enough for the both of us, my love. I carry your heart with me, and I wait for the day you return to claim it. A love story. A vibrant, beautiful woman waiting for her soldier to come home from the war. What had happened to her? Where was she now? Florence felt a pang of something sharp and painful. Jealousy, perhaps, or a profound sense of trespass. She was holding the ghost of a great love in her hands, a love that belonged to the cold, impenetrable man who held her captive. What do you think you're doing? The voice was ice. It sliced through the quiet room, and Florence gasped, dropping the photograph as if it had burned her. She spun around, her heart seizing in her chest. Walter stood in the doorway, his body a rigid silhouette against the light of the hall. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury, but his eyes were blazing. It was the most emotion she had ever seen on his face, and it was terrifying. He had never raised his voice to her, but the quiet, venomous rage in his tone was worse than any shout. I was just, she stammered, scrambling to her feet. I didn't mean any harm. He advanced into the room, his movements slow, deliberate, predatory. His gaze dropped to the scattered letters and the upturned photograph of Evelyn at her feet. The fury in his eyes guttered, extinguished in an instant by a wave of something far more devastating, a raw, unguarded pain. The mask was gone. In its place was the man from the nightmares, the man who listened to her music from the shadows. He stopped before her, looking down at the scattered remnants of his past. He seemed to forget she was even there. He knelt, not with the grace he usually possessed, but with the weary movement of an old man, and gathered the letters with a reverence that was almost holy. He picked up the photograph, his thumb gently stroking Evelyn's smiling face. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with grief. She was beautiful, Florence whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Walter's gaze lifted to meet hers. The pain in his eyes was so profound, so naked, it felt like a physical blow. He looked at Florence, truly looked at her, and for a moment she felt he wasn't seeing her at all, but the ghost of the woman in the photograph. Her name was Evelyn, he said, his voice rough, broken. She was a nurse. In France. She saw more courage and more horror than any soldier. She loved to dance. She believed the world could be beautiful, even when it was burning down around her. He paused, his throat working. She died 2 weeks before the armistice, not from a shell, from the influenza. While she was tending to dying soldiers, I was in a field hospital 10 miles away, and I never even knew. The confession hung in the air between them, stripped of all artifice. He had loved her, and he had lost her. I couldn't protect her, he said, the words barely a breath, but they held the weight of a decade of guilt. He finally stood, the photograph still clutched in his hand. His eyes, now clear and frighteningly intense, were fixed on Florence. I was a soldier. I was supposed to save people, but I couldn't save the only one that mattered. And then she understood. The coldness, the control, the obsession with her safety. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about Evelyn. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. I bought your father's debt because Vance would have destroyed you. I brought you here because in this world, innocence is a commodity to be consumed. You are the melody, Miss Hayes. They are the noise that would drown you out. He looked from the photograph in his hand to her face. I failed her, he stated, the words like chips of ice. I will not fail again. Florence stared at him, her fear warring with a sudden shocking wave of pity and a terrifying flicker of understanding. She was not his prisoner. She was his penance, his second chance, a living, breathing atonement for the ghost he could not save. And the realization of what that meant, to be the focus of such a powerful wounded man's desperate redemption, was infinitely more frightening than being any gangster's collateral. In the aftermath of his confession, a new and more suffocating silence descended upon the penthouse. The ghost of Evelyn was now a third resident in their gilded cage. She was in the mournful notes of the nocturnes Florence played, in the way Walter's gaze would sometimes drift and soften, and in the very air they breathed, thick with unspoken grief and guilt. He became more distant than ever, a phantom in his own home, his movements precise and economical, as if conserving energy for the battles he fought outside these walls. His protection of Florence intensified, but it was the protection of a curator guarding a priceless, fragile artifact, devoid of warmth or affection. For Florence, the revelation had changed everything. Pity had been her first reaction, a deep, aching sympathy for the broken soldier beneath the mob boss's armor. But pity curdled into a quiet horror. She was not a person to him. She was a symbol. She was not a life to be lived, but a debt to be paid to a ghost. The weight of his redemption was a heavier chain than any locked door. Every lavish meal, every silk dress provided, felt like an offering at Evelyn's altar. She was living a dead woman's second chance, and the knowledge was slowly erasing her. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. From her window, she watched a young couple on the street below. They were laughing, huddled together under a shared umbrella, as a sudden downpour began. The man gallantly took off his jacket and draped it over the woman's shoulders, and she stood on her toes to kiss him, a spontaneous, joyful act. It was a small, ordinary moment of freedom and affection, and it struck Florence with the force of a physical blow. She wanted that. She wanted the rain on her face, the freedom to love, the right to make her own mistakes. She would rather face the wolves like Cecil Vance on her own terms than slowly suffocate in this shrine to a dead love. The decision once made settled in her heart like a cold, hard stone. She had to escape. Her only possible ally was Mildred, the quiet housekeeper. For weeks, Florence had observed her, noting the faint disapproval in her eyes when she saw Florence's untouched plates, the flicker of sympathy when she heard a particularly sorrowful melody from the piano. Mildred was a woman of principle, trapped by circumstance, much like Florence herself. One morning, as Mildred was clearing her breakfast dishes, Florence took the gamble. "Mildred," she began, her voice low and trembling slightly, "do you think it is right for one person to own another?" The housekeeper paused, her hands still. She didn't look at Florence, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the plates. "Mr. Sterling provides you with a safe home, miss. The world outside is my world," Florence interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "For better or for worse. This isn't safety, it's preservation, like a butterfly under glass. I am not an object." Mildred finally met her gaze. In the older woman's weary eyes, Florence saw a flicker of understanding, of compassion. "What do you want from me, child?" she asked softly. "A letter," Florence whispered, a desperate plea. "Just one. To my dearest friend, Beatrice. Please." She spent the afternoon composing the letter, her words a frantic rush of coded desperation. She told Beatrice she was safe but a prisoner, describing the building and the impossible luxury of her cage. She begged for help. She sealed the note in an envelope, along with the last few dollars she had kept hidden from her time at the Gilded Sparrow, and pressed it into Mildred's hand the next day. The housekeeper accepted it with a silent, solemn nod, tucking it deep into her apron pocket. The week that followed was an agony of suspense. Every knock on the door, every time the elevator chimed, Florence's heart leaped into her throat. Walter's presence was a constant source of terror. She felt as if her betrayal was written on her face, that his cold, assessing eyes could see straight through to her desperate plan. She played the piano with a frantic energy, the music a shield for her turmoil. Then, one morning, Mildred placed a small, folded note beside Florence's teacup. It was from Beatrice. The plan was as audacious and full of life as her friend. Walter Sterling owned the building, including the exclusive, high-end speakeasy on the ground floor, the Obsidian Key. Once a month, he hosted a private party for the city's elite, judges, politicians, and businessmen who enjoyed his illegal liquor. The next party was Saturday. The building would be teeming with people, the staff distracted. Beatrice would wait in the alley behind the service exit at precisely 11 o'clock. Mildred had confirmed she could leave the service door to the back stairs unlocked for a precious few minutes. It was a sliver of a chance, but it was a chance. As Saturday approached, Florence was torn by a profound and traitorous conflict. One evening, she played a piece by Satie, a simple, haunting melody. She finished and the silence stretched on, but she knew he was there. She turned and saw him leaning against the far wall, his face in shadow, his posture conveying a deep weariness. In that moment, he didn't look like a monster or a kingpin. He looked like a man carrying an impossible burden. He was her captor, the architect of her misery, but he was also the man who had pulled her from the jaws of a terrible fate and who wrestled with demons she was only just beginning to understand. Was she truly better off in a world without his grim protection? The question haunted her right up until the night of the party. The distant thrum of a jazz band vibrated up through the floor, a siren song of the freedom that awaited her. Dressed in a simple dark dress Mildred had provided, Florence paced her room, her hands clammy, her heart a wild, chaotic rhythm against her ribs. At 10:45 she slipped out of her room. The apartment was empty. Walter was downstairs, presiding over his court. The back stairs were dark and narrow, each step creaked, the sound deafening in the silence. She emerged into the chaos of the kitchen, a whirlwind of steam, shouting chefs and clattering dishes. Head down she moved along the wall, just another shadow in the mayhem. She saw it, the service door, propped open a crack. Her heart soared. She slipped through the door into the cool, damp air of the alley. It smelled of rain and refuse, the most beautiful scent she had ever known. Freedom. It was real. She took a deep, shuddering breath, scanning the darkness for Beatrice. A figure detached itself from the shadows at the far end of the alley, but it wasn't the familiar, bob-haired silhouette of her friend. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and terrifyingly still. It was Walter. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He simply stood there, a formidable obstacle between her and the street, his face an unreadable mask in the dim light. In his hand, he held her letter to Beatrice. "The postal service in my building is exceptionally reliable," he said, his voice a low, chillingly calm rumble. "All mail is delivered directly to me." Florence's blood ran cold. The hope that had carried her this far evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, sickening dread. He had known all along. He had let her go through the motions, letting her believe she had a chance, only to snatch it away at the last second. It was the cruelest lesson he could have taught her. He walked towards her, stopping just a foot away. He didn't look at her with the fury she had seen in the library. He looked at her with a profound, soul-crushing disappointment that was infinitely worse. It was the look of a man whose last fragile hope had just been shattered. "I told you my past," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet each word was a shard of ice in her heart. "I showed you the wound that will not heal. I thought you, of all people, would understand why I have to do this." He gestured vaguely back towards the penthouse. "I thought you understood what I was trying to protect." He wasn't talking about protecting her anymore. He was talking about protecting himself from another failure, another loss. "You are not her," Florence whispered, the words tasting like ash. A muscle tightened in his jaw. "No," he agreed, his voice flat and dead. "You are not." She would never have run. He turned and walked back toward the service door, leaving her to follow. The unspoken command was absolute. The escape was over. As she walked back into the noise and heat of the kitchen, back towards the elevator that would carry her up to her cage, a chasm of silence opened between them, wider and colder than ever before. She hadn't just failed to escape his prison, she had in his eyes betrayed his trust, and in doing so, had desecrated the memory of the woman he was trying so desperately to save. The silence that followed Florence's failed escape was a living entity. It was a cold, suffocating presence that filled every corner of the penthouse, making the vast space feel smaller, more claustrophobic than ever. Walter was a ghost of a man. He moved through the apartment with a chilling economy of motion, his presence announced only by the soft click of a door or the clink of ice in his nightly glass of whiskey. His eyes, when they happened to fall on Florence, were like polished stones, hard, smooth, and utterly devoid of emotion. The fragile, unspoken connection that had begun to form between them, woven from shared music and revealed grief, had been irrevocably severed. He had shown her his deepest wound, and she had responded by trying to flee. The betrayal in his mind was absolute. For Florence, the gilded cage had lost its luster, revealing the cold iron bars beneath. She no longer played the piano. To touch the keys felt like a hypocrisy, a hollow performance for a captor who no longer listened. The music had been her language, and now there was nothing left to say. She spent her days by the window, a silent sentinel watching the pulse of a city she was no longer part of, her spirit withering in the sterile, silent air. The failed escape had done more than just reinforce her prison. It had extinguished the spark of hope that had sustained her. She had come to a terrifying realization. Walter Sterling would never let her go, not because he desired her, but because his own salvation was now inextricably linked to her captivity. But the world outside the penthouse windows was not as silent as the one within. In the grimy, smoke-filled backrooms of Chicago's underworld, whispers traveled fast. A rat will always sniff out a weakness, and Cecil Vance was a king among rats. He had been humiliated when Walter Sterling had so publicly purchased Florence Hayes from under his nose. Now, his informants brought him news that was far more interesting than a simple debt. The girl wasn't just some passing fancy. Sterling was keeping her locked away like the crown jewels. He had built a fortress around her, and a man only builds a fortress around something he cannot bear to lose. Vance, a man whose sadism was matched only by his ambition, saw his opportunity. He couldn't defeat Sterling in a straightforward war of bullets and territory. Walter's operation was too disciplined, his men too loyal. But if the girl was his weakness, his Achilles' heel, then Vance knew exactly where to aim his dagger. The war began not with a bang, but with a series of precise surgical strikes. One of Walter's most profitable gin distilleries on the south side went up in flames, the inferno lighting up the night sky. A shipment of premium Canadian whiskey, worth a fortune, was hijacked on its way into the city. The truck found abandoned and empty. The drivers vanished. Two of Walter's key enforcers were cornered in a barbershop and brutally executed, their bodies left as a gruesome message. The violence of the outside world began to seep into the penthouse. Walter started coming home later, or sometimes not at all. When he did return, he was a thundercloud of controlled fury. The scent of tobacco on his coat was sharper, sometimes mixed with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of cordite. He would pace the length of the living room for hours, his jaw clenched. his eyes burning with a cold fire that seemed to look straight through Florence, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. She learned of the escalating war in fragments, gleaned from Mildred's hushed, worried tones, and the bold, screaming headlines of the newspapers the housekeeper would leave behind. Gang war erupts, bootleg kingpins, battle for control. She saw the names: Cecil Vance, Walter Sterling, printed in stark black and white, and a cold dread coiled in her stomach. This was because of her. The burning buildings, the dead men in the streets. She was the cause, the unwitting catalyst for the storm now breaking over the city. One evening, Walter returned looking worse than she had ever seen him. His immaculate suit was rumpled and stained. There was a fresh cut above his right eyebrow, and his face was a pale, exhausted mask of granite. He didn't pace. He walked directly to the bar, pouring a whiskey with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. He downed it in one go, the glass slamming back onto the mahogany with a crack that made Florence jump. He turned, and his eyes finally, truly, landed on her. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a raw, complex emotion she couldn't name. It was a maelstrom of anger, exhaustion, and something that looked terrifyingly like regret. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" he said, his voice a low, ragged rasp. "The world outside, the one you were so desperate to run back to. This is its reality. It's not laughing couples under an umbrella, Florence. It's men bleeding out in gutters over barrels of whiskey." "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice shaking. She stood up from her chair by the window, taking a hesitant step towards him. "I just wanted to be free." "Free?" He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held no humor. "Free to be used as a pawn by a degenerate like Vance? Free to be a victim? He knows you're here. He knows you are important. Every man I've lost, every drop of blood spilled in the last month, is his way of getting to me through you." The accusation struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was right. Her existence in this apartment was the lit match that had set his world on fire. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, washed over her. "Then let me go," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "If I am the cause, then let me leave. He will have no reason to fight you anymore." Walter strode across the room until he stood before her, his height and fury eclipsing her. He gripped her upper arms, his fingers digging into her flesh, not with cruelty, but with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity. His face was inches from hers, his eyes blazing with a tormented fire. "Do you really think it's that simple?" he snarled, his voice a torrent of contained violence. "Do you think he would just let you walk away? He would take you, and he would break you, piece by piece, just to hear me scream. Letting you go now wouldn't be freedom. It would be a death sentence. Your death sentence and my damnation." His confession, screamed in a furious whisper, hung in the air between them. My damnation. It was about him. It had always been about him. But now it was about her too. He was no longer just protecting the memory of Evelyn. He was protecting Florence, the living, breathing woman whose fate was now intertwined with his. In that terrible, violent moment, Florence realized a truth that terrified her more than any prison. Her greatest fear was no longer her captivity. It was the thought of losing him to the war he was fighting in her name. He released her abruptly, as if her touch had burned him, and turned away, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of utter frustration. "Stay away from the windows," he commanded, his voice once again cold and clipped, the wall of control slamming back into place. "Don't go near them, they might be watching." He retreated to his study, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a sound of grim finality. Florence stood alone in the center of the vast, silent room, her arms throbbing where he had held her. The city lights outside, once a symbol of a life she couldn't have, now seemed menacing, the glow of 1,000 enemy eyes. The storm was no longer a distant rumble. It was here, pressing against the glass of her gilded cage, and she was right in the center of it, the terrified, unwilling eye of the hurricane. And for the first time, she began to pray not for her own freedom, but for the safety of her captor. The air in the penthouse grew thin, charged with the electric tension of an impending lightning strike. Walter became a phantom of pure, focused rage, moving in and out of the apartment at odd hours, his conversations on the telephone clipped, coded, and deadly serious. The war with Cecil Vance had reached its fever pitch. The newspapers spoke of it in hushed, fearful tones, a brutal, bloody conflict that was staining the city's cobblestones red. For Florence, the world had shrunk to the sound of the elevator arriving, the turn of a key in the lock, and the wave of relief, unwelcome but undeniable, that washed over her when she saw Walter walk through the door, alive, for one more night. Her fear for him had become a constant aching presence in her chest. She had begun to play the piano again, not for herself, but for him. She would play the softest, most soothing pieces she knew, Satie, Debussy, hoping the melodies might travel through the walls to his study, offering a moment's peace in the heart of his private war. It was a futile gesture, a prayer whispered into a hurricane, but it was all she had. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Walter was out. Mildred had served Florence a solitary dinner, her own face etched with worry, before quietly retiring for the night. The apartment was unnervingly silent, the usual city sounds seeming muffled and distant. A thick, ominous fog had rolled in from the lake, pressing against the windows and wrapping the top of the skyscraper in a damp grey shroud. It felt as if they were floating in a void, completely cut off from the world below. Florence was in the library trying to lose herself in a book when a sharp, insistent knock echoed from the front door. Her blood turned to ice. No one ever came to the front door. Visitors were met in the lobby. The only person who used that door was Walter, and he had a key. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The knock came again, louder this time, more demanding. It wasn't Mildred. It wasn't Walter. A cold, slithering dread crept up her spine. Slowly, silently, she rose and crept towards the foyer, her body pressed against the wall. She peered around the corner. Standing in the doorway, held firmly by two of Walter's guards, was a young messenger boy, his face pale with terror. One of the guards, a mountain of a man named Arthur, whom she recognized, held a small yellow envelope, a telegram. "It's for Mr. Sterling," the boy stammered. "Urgent." Arthur dismissed the boy, shut the door, and turned the envelope over in his massive hands. He saw Florence peeking from the hallway. His normally stern face softened with a flicker of concern. "It's nothing for you to worry about, miss," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Go back to your book." But Florence knew. She knew with a chilling certainty that the telegram was not just for Walter. It was about her. The fog outside, the silence, the insistent knock. It was all an overture to disaster. "Let me see it, Arthur," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He hesitated, his loyalty to Walter warring with the fear in her eyes. With a sigh of resignation, he handed it to her. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. The message was short, the typed letters stark and brutal against the yellow paper. "Sterling, have your songbird. She sings for me now. Old Kensington Distillery. Midnight. Come alone or she dies in pieces. Your territory for her life. Vance." It was a lie, a blatant, terrifying lie. She was standing right here, but the meaning was clear. It was a trap. Vance was using her as bait, banking on the fact that Walter was out, that his men would find the telegram, and that a panicked, disjointed response would leave Walter vulnerable. It was a brilliant, cruel move. "He's trying to draw him out," Arthur breathed, reading the message over her shoulder, his face grim. "He thinks we have to go find the boss. Tell him you've been taken. It'll split us up, cause chaos. Vance will have men waiting for him." Florence's mind raced, cutting through the fog of her fear with a desperate clarity. They couldn't call him. They couldn't send a message. Any attempt to warn him would be intercepted. Vance's men would be watching every line, every messenger. The only way to save him was to make sure he never walked into the trap. But how? He would come home, find the telegram, and consumed by a blind, protective fury, he would walk straight into Vance's guns. Because that's who he was. The man who wouldn't fail again. "We have to destroy it," she said, her voice urgent. "He can't see this. We have to pretend it never arrived." Arthur shook his head, his expression pained. "Miss, you don't understand. If the boss finds out we kept this from him, that we let him think you were in danger for even a second and did nothing, he'll kill us himself. My orders are to protect you and to report any threat to him immediately. And his order to you is a death sentence for him," she countered, her voice rising with frantic energy. She grabbed his arm, her small hand a stark contrast against his massive bicep. "Arthur, please. He will go alone. You know he will. He won't listen to reason. He won't wait for backup. He'll go and he will die. Is that what you want?" The guard's face was a mask of tormented indecision. She was right. He knew the boss's code. He knew the guilt he carried. He would trade his entire empire for her life without a second's hesitation. In that moment, Florence Hayes, the sheltered pianist, the frightened prisoner, vanished. In her place stood a woman who would not stand by and watch the man who saved her, the man who imprisoned her, the man who was inextricably part of her, walk to his execution. "There is another way," she said, an idea, insane and terrifying, blooming in her mind. He wants the songbird at the distillery. Then that is what he will get. Before Arthur could process her words, she spun around and ran, not towards her room, but towards the elevator. She jabbed the button, her heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm. "Miss, no!" Arthur bellowed, rushing after her. "Stop!" The elevator doors slid open. She darted inside. He was a second too late. The bronze gate slid shut between them, his horrified face the last thing she saw. The ride down was a descent into madness. She was acting on pure, primal instinct. Walter had once told her she was the melody. Tonight, she would be the distraction. She would change the tune of Vance's fatal symphony. She burst out into the lobby, ignoring the stunned doorman, and ran into the foggy street, hailing the first taxi she saw. "The old Kensington distillery," she gasped to the driver, who gave her a strange look, but nodded, pulling the cab into the sparse traffic. The distillery was a skeletal ruin on the edge of the city, a place of shadows and decay. As the taxi pulled away, leaving her in the oppressive silence, the full weight of her decision crashed down on her. This was suicide, but it was better than waiting in a cage for the news of Walter's death. She didn't have to wait long. Two of Vance's men materialized from the fog, grabbing her roughly. They dragged her inside, into the cavernous main room of the distillery. The air was thick with the smell of rust, rot, and stale alcohol. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, stood Cecil Vance. He was smaller than she expected, impeccably dressed in a pearl grey suit, a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on his thin lips. "Well, well," he purred, circling her like a shark. "The little songbird, delivered right to my door. I must admit I didn't expect this. Tell me, is Sterling really so stupid as to send you alone?" "He doesn't know I'm here," Florence said, lifting her chin, forcing a bravery she did not feel. "I came myself." Vance's smirk widened into a grin. "Even better. A gesture of loyalty. How touching. It will make your death all the more poetic." Suddenly the roar of a powerful engine cut through the night, followed by the screech of tires. Headlights flooded the grimy windows of the distillery. Walter. Arthur must have found a way to warn him. Her heart both soared and plummeted. He was here. He was walking into the trap. The main doors burst open. Walter Sterling stood there, a silhouette of righteous fury against the blinding lights. He wasn't alone. Behind him, emerging from the fog, were at least a dozen of his men, armed with Tommy guns and shotguns. Arthur had brought the entire army. Vance's face contorted in rage. "A trick!" he spat. He grabbed Florence, pressing the cold, hard muzzle of a pistol to her temple. "One more step, Sterling, and I'll paint the walls with her brains." Walter stopped, holding up a hand to his men. His eyes, burning with a terrifying cold fire, were locked on Florence. They were filled with a fury so profound it stole her breath, but underneath it, she saw a flicker of raw, undisguised terror, fear for her. "Let her go, Vance." Walter's voice was lethally calm. "This is between us." "It was," Vance sneered, his grip tightening on Florence. "But she made it her business when she came here, a tragic mistake." In that split second, with the gun pressed to her head and Walter's horrified eyes on her, Florence did the only thing she could. She acted. With a guttural scream, she stomped her heel down hard on Vance's instep and threw all her weight backwards, driving her head into his jaw. The gun fired, the sound a deafening explosion in the enclosed space. The bullet went wide, shattering a window. Vance staggered, momentarily stunned. It was all the opening Walter needed. "Now!" he roared. The distillery erupted into a maelstrom of chaos and violence. Muzzle flashes lit the cavernous room in strobing, hellish bursts. The deafening roar of Tommy guns echoed off the walls. Florence scrambled away on the floor, crawling behind a row of rusted barrels. The battle was brutal and swift. Walter's men were disciplined, overwhelming Vance's unprepared crew. Through the smoke and chaos she saw Walter. He moved not like a gangster but like a soldier, a deadly predator in his element. He ignored the other men, his entire focus on one target. He advanced on Vance, who was desperately trying to reload. Walter closed the distance, a blur of motion, and the two men crashed together in a savage, primal struggle. A shot rang out. Florence screamed as she saw Walter stagger back, his hand clutching his side, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his white shirt. But even as he was hit, he drove a fist into Vance's throat, sending the smaller man gasping to his knees. Walter stood over him, his face a mask of pain and pure, unadulterated fury, his own gun now pressed under Vance's chin. For a moment, absolute silence descended, broken only by the ragged gasps of the wounded. Walter's men had won. He held Vance's life in his hands. He looked from Vance's terrified face to Florence, huddled behind the barrels. His blazing eyes met hers, and in them she saw the war finally end. He didn't pull the trigger. He lowered the gun. "Get him out of my city," he ordered his men, his voice a low, pained growl. "If I ever see his face again, I'll kill him." His men dragged Vance away. The storm was over. And then the strength that had held him upright seemed to abandon him. Walter collapsed to his knees, his hand pressed tightly to the bleeding wound in his side, his eyes never leaving Florence's face. The journey back to the penthouse was a blur of speed and suffocating silence. Arthur drove the black Ford with a frantic urgency, while Florence sat in the back, cradling Walter's head in her lap. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat in the flashing city lights. The imposing, invincible man who commanded an empire was gone. In his place was a soldier, wounded and vulnerable, his breathing shallow and ragged. She pressed a piece of torn silk from her dress against the bleeding wound in his side, her hands stained with his blood, the warm metallic scent filling the enclosed space. The roles had been violently, terrifyingly inverted. He was no longer her keeper. She was his lifeline. They bypassed the grand lobby using a private service elevator that opened directly into the apartment. Arthur and another guard helped carry Walter inside, laying him gently on the long sofa in the living room, his head resting on the velvet cushions. A doctor, a grim-faced man with a black bag and eyes that asked no questions, had been summoned and was already waiting. Florence was pushed aside as the doctor worked, but she refused to leave the room. She stood by the grand piano, her silent sentinel, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She watched as the doctor cut away the blood-soaked shirt, cleaned the wound and with a few deft, painful movements extracted the bullet. She watched Walter's body arch in agony, a low, guttural groan escaping his lips, the only sound he made. Mildred was there, her face a mask of professional calm, handing the doctor instruments and basins of water, but her worried eyes kept flicking towards Florence. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor was finished. He had stitched and bandaged the wound, administered a shot of morphine, and left a bottle of laudanum with curt instructions. He was lucky, the doctor grunted as he packed his bag. An inch to the left, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. He'll need rest. No visitors, and someone needs to watch him for fever. With a nod to Arthur, he was gone, another secret swallowed by the city's night. Mildred and the guards retreated, leaving Florence alone with the sleeping form of her captor. The morphine had taken hold, pulling him under into a deep, drug-induced slumber. The harsh lines of his face were softened in sleep, the iron control finally relinquished. He looked younger, almost peaceful, save for the stark white of the bandage against his skin. The sun had not yet risen, but a faint pearlescent grey was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, silhouetting the city's skyline. A new day was being born from the ashes of the violent night. Florence pulled a chair to the side of the sofa, dipped a cloth in a basin of cool water, and began to gently wipe the sweat and grime from his forehead. It was a gesture of such profound intimacy that it made her own heart ache. For months, he had watched over her sleep. Now, she would watch over his. She stayed there for 2 days, leaving his side only when Mildred insisted she eat or rest. Walter drifted through a feverish haze, sometimes murmuring names she didn't know, words from a long-forgotten war. During his brief moments of lucidity, his eyes would find her, a flicker of confusion and disbelief in their depths before the pain and drugs pulled him back under. In those moments, he said nothing, but his gaze was a question she could not answer. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. She awoke from a light doze in her chair to find him watching her, his eyes clear and lucid for the first time. The coldness was gone, stripped away by pain and vulnerability, leaving behind something raw and exposed. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm still here," she confirmed softly. He tried to sit up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his side. She gently pushed him back down. "The doctor said you must rest," he acquiesced, his head falling back against the cushions. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, no longer suffocating, but filled with the weight of all that had happened. "Evelyn," he said, the name a quiet breath of sound. "She would have done what you did, run towards the danger. She never knew when to be afraid." He turned his head, his gaze finding hers, holding it. "When I saw you in that distillery, with his gun to your head. It was like seeing her ghost, and I understood. My mistake was never about failing to protect her. It was about trying to own her memory. It was about trying to turn you into a monument for my own guilt. Tears pricked Florence's eyes, but she did not let them fall. She just listened. I built this cage for you, Florence, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. But I think in the end, I was the one who was truly imprisoned, chained to a ghost. Chained to a mistake I could never undo. He took a slow, painful breath. The war with Vance is over. His operation is broken. He won't be back. The threat is gone. He gestured with his good hand towards the formidable desk in the corner of the room. In the top drawer you will find an envelope. It contains more than enough money to start a new life anywhere you choose. There is also a one-way ticket for the afternoon train to New York. The debt is paid. Everything is paid. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the deepest sorrow she had ever witnessed. It was the sorrow of a man truly letting go. "You are free, Florence Hayes," he said, the words costing him more than the bullet had. "You were right. Freedom isn't something one person can grant another. It's something you must take for yourself. Go. Live the life you were meant to have. Play in the grand symphony halls. Find a man who can give you a home with a garden, not a fortress in the sky." An hour later she stood on the bustling platform of Union Station, the envelope heavy in her coat pocket, the train ticket clutched in her hand. The air was filled with the hiss of steam, the cries of porters, and the echoing announcements of destinations she had only ever dreamed of. This was it, the moment she had longed for, plotted for, nearly died for, freedom. She watched the families embracing, the lovers kissing goodbye, the businessmen rushing past with their important faces. She was anonymous, untethered, a ghost in the crowd, free to go anywhere, to be anyone, and she had never felt more alone. She thought of the life that awaited her, a quiet life, a safe life, a life of gentle melodies played in quiet rooms, a life without the threat of violence, without the cold weight of a gangster's gaze, a life without him. The conductor's voice boomed through the station. "All aboard for the 20th Century Limited, now boarding on track 4. Her train, her future. She looked at the ticket in her hand, then closed her eyes. She heard not the conductor's call, but the memory of a Debussy piece filling a silent penthouse. She felt not the jostle of the crowd, but the memory of his hand on her arm, a desperate, protective grip. She saw not the promise of a New York stage, but the image of his wounded, vulnerable face as he told her she was free. He thought freedom for her was a world without him in it. He was wrong. A world without him would not be freedom. It would be a colorless, silent exile. Her life with him had been a terrifying, chaotic, and brutal symphony, but it had been a symphony. A life without him would be nothing but silence. With a certainty that settled deep in her soul, she tore the train ticket in half, the two pieces fluttering from her fingers to the grimy platform. She turned her back on the train, on the promise of New York, on the safe, quiet life she was supposed to want, and walked out of the station. When she used her new key, a key Mildred had pressed into her hand that morning to let herself back into the penthouse, he was standing by the window, looking out at the city, his silhouette slumped in defeat. He heard the door and turned slowly, his face a mask of carefully controlled heartbreak. When he saw her, his eyes widened in disbelief, and a wave of raw, unshielded hope washed over his features. "You came back," he breathed, as if he were seeing a miracle. "So you are a fool, Walter Sterling," she said softly, walking towards him, stopping just before him. "You think my melody is a simple one, meant for quiet rooms and polite applause. You don't understand. I was never meant to be a lullaby." She reached up and gently touched the side of his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "My music, my life. It has rage in it, and sorrow, and a dangerous, desperate kind of love," she whispered. "It was never meant for a solo performance." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, a shudder running through his powerful frame. "Florence," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "You are my home," she stated, a simple, irrefutable truth. "This dangerous, beautiful, complicated man, this cage in the sky, it's not a prison. Not anymore." He opened his eyes, and in their winter sky depths, she saw not a gangster or a soldier, but a man who had finally found his peace. He slowly wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close with a gentle reverence, mindful of his wound. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. Below them, the city roared on, a chaotic orchestra of jazz and ambition. But up here, in their fortress in the sky, a new piece was beginning. It was not a gentle nocturne or a tragic lament. It was a symphony, complex and soaring, composed for two souls who had found their freedom not in escape, but in each other.